passed. Okay. Start Rosalind's up first?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Pass these out.
About a minute ago, we got this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Where are you, over here?
I'll be wherever you need me to be.
I'll let you pick where you
Sorry, it
sit.
took me a few minutes to get up here.
That's the anchor. That's the anchor spot.
Yeah. Over here, that way if,
I thought this was a calendar.
a calendar?
You're disappointed, right? This is the end of
Just
the.
some of them are
There's
counting.
no pictures. There's no pictures on here. Look, at least some kind of pictures.
They lose their independence if they give you a calendar.
You want to?
No, man, if they give
need
it to
pictures on a
everybody,
calendar,
this should
you
be
know?
like a 2020 calendar. That's what I thought this was.
Next year we can do a picture book.
Makes sense.
Not swag.
Okay, so this is our presentation to the audit committee on the conclusion of our audit. You have, a couple weeks ago, you got the latest draft of the CAFR. There's a couple tweaks that are being made, but the printed version should come in the next couple weeks. Right. Is that right, Phil?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
But anyway, we're far enough along to conclude on the audit, and I was going to go through this for the audit committee and kind of summarize how the audit went, what were some of the major areas. You didn't get to see, well, a couple of you got to see the planning, well, 3 of you got to see the planning, so you can kind of compare back to how our plan went, but everything went as planned. But for the new folks in the room, I'll go through the points. On the first page, you see, or label 2 is the agenda. These are the main items I'll be going through. On page 3 is our engagement team members. There's obviously a lot of components in this audit, and we divvy up the responsibilities amongst various managers and partners. Today I have with you Lindsay Ellis, as I introduced these people last time, but Lindsay Ellis is a manager on the CAFR and the overall central government audit. Dell Crossland is a customer service principal and concurring reviewer on various engagements. And then David Hunt is back here. He was the first principal on this engagement for 8 years before I took over 2 years ago. But he is still the first principal on the water and sewer audit and runs concurrent with our DBE firms on the hospital and public school system. On page 4, I detail what our responsibilities are as compared to what management's responsibilities are. Ours, obviously, our point is to express an opinion about whether the financial statements are prepared by management under the oversight of this committee and are fairly presented in all material respects, and we believe they are. Number 2, when performing our audits, that we perform it in accordance with GAS and government audit standards. Remember, you have the single audit that we'll have the results on those. Hopefully, that will be issued by the end of this month, but the next committee meeting, hopefully, we can present any findings on that. And the single audit is under the uniform guidance, what used to be called A133. Obviously, we have to maintain independence in fact and appearance, and professional skepticism through the audit. And then we're required to report to you, those in charge of governance of Metropolitan Nashville's audit. And then over here on the right side of the page, you go through management, what their responsibilities are. The team drafts the CAFR and makes sure that it's in compliance with GAAP. Make sure they adopt the proper accounting policies and that those are follow GAAP. Maintain effective internal controls over reporting and compliance, doing the things that they need to do to detect and prevent fraud. All of these things we test, and I'll go through those later on this presentation. And then obviously disclosing to this committee and to us any findings or significant things they need to tell us about. On page 5, we are independent, in fact, in appearance, in accordance with AICPA's professional Code, Rule 101. On page 6 is our requirements under SAS 99, which is the auditing standard that helps auditors specifically address the risk of material misstatement, specifically due to fraud. And so there's 4 really things, main categories that we do. We gather information. A lot of that is us internally brainstorming where are these high-risk areas of fraud, where to go look. A lot of it is inquiry amongst management. And then we investigate those high-risk areas. We test for management override. Mainly that's looking for unusual journal entries or specifically manual journal entries and significant estimates that change drastically. There's a number of things we look at, but those are the main ones. And we respond to those identified risks. And then we evaluate the audit evidence after we have tested that. And if we do find anything, we would report it to this committee. On page 7, these are just a summary of our deliverables. The Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, that's your CAFR. It is an unmodified opinion. We also issue a separate report on the General Hospital. We're expecting to close that and issue it in 2 days.
Yeah, next couple of days.
And it's an unmodified opinion.
So, can I ask, what is the issue with General Hospital?
Issue?
Yeah.
Issue.
No, we're expecting to issue the report.
To issue.
Yeah, there's not an issue.
Yeah, there's no issue.
Expect to,
It's clean this year.
yeah,
So you might have been heard, I've met General Hospital before.
yeah.
Well, with that, you may want to kind of give a brief history of your opinion on General Hospital.
David?
Well, in the past, I mean, there were a number of years where we had a going concern opinion, just because there were some issues with them not being able to sustain themselves necessarily on the subsidy that the council had approved in previous years, and they had to go back to the council, and the council had to increase those subsidies. But the last 2 years, they've been able to get by with the subsidy that was originally approved by Metro, and and the subsidy for this upcoming year, I think, is lower by about $1 million. But based on their performance this year and the improvements that they've made as far as cost cutting and some other measures, they've really had a very big improvement with the new CFO over the last couple of years, and he has really monitored and maintained things and changed and improved controls, and so it's our opinion that they'll be able to make it on the subsidy for this upcoming year, unless something
It's a subsidy.
significant or drastic. It's $44 million for 2020.
It changed drastically. Okay.
Last year it was $45 million. This year 44. But 2 years ago they had to go back for additional, and it was like 49 million. So.
Now, in your report, do you get into admissions or revenue and?
Yeah, we look at all those areas, obviously, yeah. All the significant, high-risk areas for a hospital and their financial statements. So, yeah, we look at the relationship with them and Parallon, who is their outsourced third-party billing company, as well as everything, all balance sheet items, revenue items that are significant and high risk.
Thank you for the clarification. I try to a little humor to a tough situation there, but my fingers are crossed. I'm cheering for General Hospital.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you for
we
your
all
hard work
are.
there. And I know that board and management team's working hard to make a
Yeah,
lot of
they
improvements. So.
really are. And I think the continuity that they've had the last couple of years has really been helpful to them, within the finance and accounting function especially, so.
Great. Well, thanks for all your hard work there too.
Do you want to, while you're talking, do you want to give an update on MNPS, just that we're about to,
Yeah, MMPS, well, of course,
the
just,
internal school fund?
yeah, the internal school funds, it is on the verge of being issued as well, and that's, the individual cafeteria-type funds within each individual school itself. So there are a number of funds that are held by the individual schools. Could be for various purposes, library fund, band fund, whatever it is. I mean, they're all small, and, the balances are small, but that's part of the process of the audit. A lot of that work has been done by one of our DBEs for a number of years, and they do a lot of that type of work. So, but we're wrapping that up right now, and we should be able to issue that report final probably within the next week and a half to 2 weeks max, or probably a week and a half.
following down the list after MNPS, the single audit, that's also set to be issued by the end of the month. Later on here, I've identified the major programs that we're testing. Other deliverables, required communication, that's what this is today. And then the management letter and the data collection form, that'll come subsequent to the single audit's completion. On page 8 is our audit methodology and approach, summing up thousands of hours of work in one page. So it's very summarized, but obviously audit planning and risk assessment is the guts of the audit. I mean, that's the beginning of the audit. That's where we update and document all of our understanding of Metro systems, its related risk areas, its internal controls, significant balances, transactions. We're trying to find areas where the controls are strong, where it makes sense for us to rely on those, and therefore we would test those and rely. And some areas, they might have strong internal controls, but it makes more sense to do substantive procedures. And so that's where we're breaking down the different sections of the audit and either testing controls or doing substantive testing. Obviously, if you're building $100-something million criminal justice center, it's almost easier just to pull invoices and look at contracts and really dig down into the third-party items that are available to substantiate those balances. But on the other end, when we do disbursements testing, we're going to cover some of those transactions, just maybe not specifically for each project. And then completion and reporting. This is part of our report, obviously. On page 9, I drilled down a little bit more on control test and the areas that we did control testing down the left side of the page. And on the right side of the page, those are the areas where we did substantial substantive test. And sometimes they cross, sometimes there's items where we can do both. But on the right side, if it's OPEB or pension, we're looking at actuarial reports. If it's investments or cash, we're sending confirmations. The more third-party resources you can use, the better in an external audit. On page 10 is our single audit, and under uniform guidance, these are the 6 programs that we are testing, and they're coming along as planned. So, and Kevin has alerted to us that he will help us any way we can if we run into a rut. We haven't thus far, but we're ready to call you when we do. Stay on task.
Can you explain why we did not qualify?
This is the last year you got hung up 2 years ago on the going concern on the hospital. It was so what Brack's talking about is under the single audit, if you qualify as a low-risk auditee, we as auditors would only have to cover 20% of your total federal expenditures during the year. Cover meaning test. If you are a high-risk auditee, we have to cover 40%. For a number of years, you had various parts of the Metro government that had material weaknesses, which precludes you from being low risk for 2 subsequent years after that material weakness. On the early years, I know most of those were in the constitutional offices one way or the other. Got all those cleared up. 2 years went by. New standard came out that added if you have any component has a going concern issue, you can't be low risk. It just so happened that was the first year that's when the hospital had its issues and we had a going concern. So we're having to wait 2 more years. So if we get through the single audit this year with no material weaknesses, and right now we don't have any going concern issues, next year might be the first year in a long time to be low risk. So we cover 20% of federal expenditures instead of 40, which obviously would cut down the number of major programs we have to test. Now, programs you still have to test it every 3rd year if it's a type A major program. So, you can't get away from that no matter how low risk you are.
John, is it a pretty significant expense we're paying to have these audited at this level?
It depends on the year, but yeah, it can be. Yeah.
I think what our agreement says is anything over 8, we charge you by the programs a certain amount.
Right. So this year it's 6.
Yeah, so,
So it's not this year.
but in the flood year, we had 16,
16.
I think, you know? So it just depends on the year and how it falls, you know, as to whether the
Last year it didn't
quantity of
I think
actual
last year was
programs.
3 or 4.
Well, thank you for that. It was not a criticism of what's happened to the fees, but rather, in the budget crisis that
Right.
we seem to have, we're looking for anything we can, and coming off of a high-risk situation, every little bit helps, right?
Yeah. There was no additional fees this year because you were under the 8, and we don't, you know, if you're low risk next year, chances are slim that,
On page 11 is just a section, significant activity, unusual items. Grants are always testing expenditures and those reimbursement compliance testing, anything, those grants kind of come and go, and so we always include that in this section. New debt, you obviously had a new bond issuance during the year, $700-something million. So, capital projects, there were a number of those this year, like the Criminal Justice Center. The Bellevue ICE was 25 million. Wrote that down somewhere, I don't know where I
25, I
wrote it.
think.
And
30
so,
million with including payments.
right. And so there were, what were a couple others? I think I wrote them.
Well, the Criminal Justice Center and the Police Department headquarters, and also the
Family
fairgrounds.
justice.
Family Justice.
Yes,
yeah.
thank you. And the fairgrounds was also
So it was,
significant.
there was significant, and there were significant last year too that were in construction in progress that weren't being depreciated, that were, reclassed into service and began depreciation. So that's a time that, we want to hone in on those new, although technically they were additions last year, they were new to be capital assets being depreciated this year, so we want to look at that. There was a restatement in the water sewer depreciation schedule of 6.4 million. It was a restatement of the beginning net position. What happened, there were certain fixed assets, and we took hours and hours with various people from water and sewer trying to figure out exactly what happened. I think we feel better about which assets were not being properly depreciated than we do about necessarily how it happened.
I think we know how it happened. It was
Yeah.
a system issue. There were certain assets that were coded a certain way that just excluded them from the depreciation calculations.
But it all related to depreciation of those assets,
Right.
not the
Right.
proper capitalization of it.
Right.
Yeah, and because of that issue, we did do additional procedures across all of Metro's capital assets to ensure that that was the only fund affected.
Not just water and sewer, across the board. So, the only place we saw it happen was water and sewer. And then the state comptroller issues, I know that was spoken about in length last audit committee meeting, and there are a couple places in the state CAFR that paragraphs are mentioned about that issue and how it's being taken care of going forward.
Yeah, so I'll comment on that. The comptroller and I are in close contact. I expect to have some news on the comptroller's position about the budget and a few other things, probably the next 24 to 48 hours. And I know Phil's kind of holding printing and so forth, so we see what the outcome of that is. So if we can hold just a little bit longer until we have a more official position, I think that would be ideal.
Page 12 is accounting pronouncements adopted this year. Neither one of these really affected Metro, at least not very much. The ARO is the one that, most of the time it either affected governments materially or not. It did not Metro. But we did look into that, mostly in the water and sewer area, but did not affect Metro this year. Page 13 are just additional required communications from the auditors to the audit committee. We could do it in writing or verbally. We choose to do it both just to, so you can ask any questions you want. Accounting estimates, we look at those estimates, make sure they're in compliance with GAAP and that they're reasonable, and we believe they are. Any unaudited information in the CAFR, we read all the information, and we did not note anything materially inconsistent. with the government's basic financial statements. Other is no transactions for which there is lack of authoritative guidance or consensus. All significant transactions been recognized in the proper period. There were no alternative accounting practices or policies. No difficulties encountered during the audit. No disagreements with management. Management provided appropriate representations at the conclusion of the audit. They do so in a management representation letter where they rep to the auditors that they have given us everything that we've requested in order for us to properly do our job. And we're not aware of any communications that management have with other independent accountants, which is okay to do. We just want to be part of that conversation to ensure that the proper facts are presented. On page 14, there were no unrecorded audit differences. And page 15, these are just upcoming accounting developments. I won't go through these in specific because, quite frankly, I don't think any of these are really going to have a material effect on Metro, but I do want, do you agree with that?
I mean, the fiduciary activity is gonna change the presentation of
Yeah,
how
right.
those funds are presented, but we don't do significant leases, so there's not
Right.
a big impact there. I don't think the others are really relevant.
But we do want, you're in community where you're expected to know what's coming out and whether they affect the entities that you govern. And so we always want to present any new issuances coming up.
Don, did the city have much in the way of operating leases that you had to make adjustments for?
No. I don't think any of the component units that I'm not thinking of, hospital or anything.
The only
Not the
lease,
ones that
the
we-
hospital has the lease with Harry for the
Right.
building, which is a capital lease, so that's not gonna change
That's
the
not-
accounting anyway.
Right.
But outside of that, no.
Anybody have any questions or areas they want to cover with more
Not right
detail
now.
or?
Would have rather had a calendar, I'm just.
And I second with more pictures next time.
Maybe we can work on a picture calendar.
Pictures and graphs and.
On your presentation, you don't show comparative balance sheets, do you?
No.
Year over year?
Oh, in the cap, no.
Yeah. When was the post-retirement benefits?
The OPEB,
Yeah,
that was last year,
that was in 18?
yes.
And your footnote on that, and I guess we have a negative net position. How do y'all handle that? Or is it?
Where are you?
I'm just,
Yeah, we have a negative issue.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a product of.
it's only because we recorded something we've
Right,
known
it's
about
a
forever.
product of
There's no
OPEB
difference.
and the pension.
I just
mean,
wonder how y'all handle that, and,
Well, I mean, the actuary gives us
but
so it is, like, as far as going concern go?
No, just, we went from a footnote to recording it, and did you make any,
There was-
any mention of that in
Oh,
your
yeah,
footnotes?
and the disclosures changed significantly last year as well
Okay.
for OPEB. They
That was
refer to
18.
it as enhanced,
Okay,
enhanced disclosures. Yeah, absolutely. I think most people would say the pension and the OPEB footnotes are even too long,
yeah.
but it's a good question.
And, any other questions that we have? Because I guess we need to accept this today. Do y'all have any other open items? I know that Kevin you said there was something that,
Yeah, so there was a subsequent footnote and then I think some other text elsewhere in the CAFR pertaining to the comptroller's position this day, having not approved its budget, right? So that is something we've added a note about. I've got good reason to believe we may be able to take that out with the developments we've had this week, but I need to confirm those and get those documented. So what I would suggest is that we hold here for the next few days until we can get that finalized.
It's on B110.
If that note can come out, then that'd be ideal for Metro.
well, I guess that
Do we have to delay the vote for that?
Well, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, that note is gonna be subject to our outside auditors agreeing to it or not. So, I think we can go ahead and accept everything as it is, and note the fact that the draft we see could be changed for that one. That's what I'd recommend, but you, Terry, Gina?
That's fine. Because we're aware of it, it's in the minutes.
And if there's something materially changes, then obviously that, our approval of this, needs to be redone.
Okay, so can we make that as a motion? I'd make that motion.
I'll second.
Okay, any further discussion? All in favor?
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of approving it, knowing that this one footnote could be removed. But what we're seeing here is with it in here, wherever it is.
Yeah, and it's noted once in the MD&A as well.
Okay.
On A12. Page A12.
There'll be a few lines come out of General Hospital too.
I mean, we'll hold General Hospital open too, because we've added, there's some additional disclosure in there that says the subsidy's been approved by the Metro Council, subject to the state's approval, and we'd be able to take that part out if you were able to take out, the disclosure that you're talking about, Kevin.
Yeah, sure. So look, we are working with the state right now to get the budget approved. I'm hopeful that that's going to happen here this week, and it would be ideal if that note would come out because, this is a record that's going to be there for a long time. And when I look at, the CAFRs that are posted, for example, on our website, they go back to 2002. And when we open them up and look at the schedules, that takes you all the way back to the 1990s, right? And if you wanted to go back and get the paper copies and read what was happening then, that's a great thing. But regrettably, when you put a subsequent event note in this year that may tarnish us a bit, the next year it just maybe is not there, and you wonder what happened. And without some color on that, it'd be unfortunate. So with the CAFR being rather permanent, almost archival document that a lot of folks look to over a period of time, I'd like to do the best we can, even if we've got to hold up printing here for a few days and see what the news is. And it could be that it stays. We may be unsuccessful in attaining the approvals I'm hopeful for, but on the other hand, if it can come out, that'd be great.
And just for the committee's sake, we changed the timing of this to have this meeting before it gets released versus reviewing it after release. So this is a big improvement.
Sure.
So any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Is that all you guys have?
As far as I know.
Okay, just one.
Thank you as always for your hard work. I know when I'm on the Fulton campus, you guys are working hard out there, and I know it's a lot of work to push this through. And I know I've leaned on you a little bit about the single audit report because the comptroller would like to see that by the end of the month. So thank you for doing that. I know it's challenging.
Okay, next agenda item.
So, on pages 15 through 18, this is the annual self-assessment that the staff, the staff do on behalf of the audit committee to make sure that we've met all the requirements and expectations. And with the exception of 2 items that you'll see in the unfinished business where we did not accept them and we need to vote today to do that, everything else was good.
Good. Is this,
Those of you who are new, what that means is we're checking things like, did we approve minutes, did we post minutes timely, did
So
we?
just process check to make sure that you did
Yes.
all the right things, like
Right.
you said you would.
It's a checklist process that we go through just
So
to make
you
sure.
like audit your own people to make sure you did. Okay, thanks.
yeah, I
We're
guess,
auditing you,
I guess
the audit committee.
we have a couple ways to do this unless it's per bylaw, we have to do it today. We can either accept this today or review it and technically send any comments in and accept it the next meeting, which would, do we have to do it today?
Accept the self-assessment?
Yes.
You don't have to do it today.
What I'm saying is, review this, any comments or concerns, let Gina know, and then we'll approve this report next time.
Good information. I wasn't here during most of that time, but
Is it something we have to have a formal motion on?
We will, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Because this is the first time we've seen this, right? Yeah, I think that'd be proper. And I'm sure Charles will review it.
I'm sure.
And probably the next order of business would be the annual bylaws review. I guess that would probably fall.
Right, so this is where you just review the bylaws, let us know if you have any changes. We can make the changes, and then you would need to have a vote to accept.
Did we make any changes with bylaws?
Since the
Prior year.
prior year. I don't think so.
We didn't make any changes. Did we go over this on the orientation to the new members of the town?
I did yesterday. Thank you. Is there anything that comes to mind that's been controversial or problematic about the operation of the bylaws?
I can't think of anything.
They seem to be working well.
Okay, I think since people have seen this and it hasn't changed from last year, it's an orientation, do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Okay, so audit of cooperative purchases, best practices.
So, last year during the MNPS investigation, a lot of discussion happened around MNPS's cooperative purchases, which is basically where they would enter into a pool of purchases in order to get better buying power and better prices. Through that, conversations wondered about what Metro does for our cooperative purchases. So we put this audit on the annual audit plan to look into. We started with the past 3 years, from July of 17 up until current. And what we found basically is that Metro doesn't do many cooperative purchases outside of state purchases. We use a lot of state contracts, but for cooperative purchases through other organizations, we found 2 within that 3-year audit period. We looked at them, we looked at the documentation underneath them, we looked at best practices to see where Metro fit in with best practices in our policies and our procedures. And we found that in a lot of instances, Metro actually exceeds the best practices. We require more signatures, we require more look at the documentation. Pretty much all that came out of this audit was a few low-risk findings, which mostly had to do with organizing the documentation that supported these cooperative purchases. So we have recommended that finance or procurement begin to put all of the documentation for the support of why this is the best purchase opportunity for Metro, the justification, and the background research that was done in a centralized location such as iProcurement. That was accepted and has already begun being implemented as they begin to upload more documentation into the new iProcurement system. Another one was just that they dispense the current form that's being used. A new form was put into place recently for cooperative purchases where it has to go to procurement to get approval with a certain information. We recommended that they add justification to this form so that it's in one place for people to easily see why they've gone this route. Procurement has already updated the form to include this. And the last one just being to make sure that Metro departments are aware of the form and the process, because cooperative purchases have the opportunity of, since they can be smaller dollars, they could get through without somebody noticing that it's a cooperative purchase. So we think that education of the departments to make sure they know about the form and the process is important. And this also has already been happening with the release of policies and the updated procedures that have happened.
Just so I know, is there a central procurement officer that goes across departments to monitor and manage those buys? I'm just
Yes.
learning.
This is Michelle Lane,
Okay.
our purchasing agent,
Okay,
and that would be her.
okay, good, thank you.
Lauren, there's one sentence on page 3 of the report. I know this is relatively minor as far as maybe the dollar amount of what we're talking about. But the sentence says, none of the 25 total purchase orders had justification, supporting documentation, or approval. within the I-procurement.
Yes.
But they did have email.
Yes.
So is that, I assume that's no problem?
That's correct. That leads to our recommendation of just putting in a central location so that it's easy for everybody to access. It took a little going back and forth because everything was documented. It was in emails or it was in other areas. But since the department is doing this on their own, they're keeping a lot of documentations at their department and not necessarily within I-procurement so that somebody could go back and check. And so it was all there, it just was not in a central location.
Okay, that sentence just sounds a little ominous.
It's not as bad as it sounds.
So I remember this issue coming up with the schools. What I don't remember is what happened with the schools. Do we know? I remember the schools took advantage of this, the school system took advantage of this type of contracting process. And that's where the concern was generated. So, understand, this isn't an issue, but I'm trying to figure out what happened with the schools. Do we remember?
Schools, what ended up, there was somewhat of a disagreement on our office. Believed that they still were within the scope of the code, that they were appropriate.
Yeah, I'd have, the people who are involved with that are no longer here. I'd have to go back and look at the,
So I think there's a statute.
There's
The statute allows them to do it,
yes.
but there was just, I think, an overall concern about what happened with utilizing that process. And I don't know. This is one of those things, Mr. Chairman, where I think we do a good job of looking at stuff, but then the question is, do we go back and make sure that whatever was the concern got addressed? And I just don't remember.
We'll follow up on that to make sure that I know that Mark did some work after some of the meetings, and so we can follow up on that.
Just something, just so we know what the.
Yeah, and we have
that's all about.
I believe you guys did a summary of all outstanding recommendations going way
through
back.
that
And you're keeping more or less a status of that.
Since that was tied to an investigation, I don't know that recommendations
Okay, it could
necessarily
be.
came out of that.
But follow up and is really it is strong, so. Okay, any other questions? Okay, audit of unusual transactions.
okay, this has not had a little bit of a different tenor to it, a little different taste. One of the things that's been very kind of trendy in auditing the last decade or so has been data analytics, where you can take a whole data set, you go in there data mining, or you slice and dice the information where you're looking for things that could be anomalies or things that look unusual. And we used to have that skill set in our office. We had a couple of people that were really strong in that skill set. We've lost that. Lauren's our current champion. She's real good with that. But we have staff members that are really wanting to get involved and learn about data analytics. So we were thinking, what can we look at to kind of help somebody develop in that particular area? And so we were looking at all these different things, and we ended up looking specifically at fuel card transactions. And that's where, let's say you're a police officer, you have a car, or you're a park staff member who you have a lawnmower. We have to fill those things up with gas. So we have, one of the ways that you can do that is through fuel cards. And so we worked with General Services. They helped give us the data set. And we're saying, what can we do to look, what kind of different things could we look at? So we ended up looking at two different things. One would be transactions made outside the state of Tennessee. And then the second would be multiple transactions within a day. Now, the ones that were the multiple transactions, we pulled police and fire out because you would expect them to possibly have those. So then we extracted that information with our analytical software. And then from there, we pulled a sample and we followed up with the departments to see, hey, were these legitimate purchases? With the out-of-state transactions, that's where we had a little bit of an issue. There were 7 that actually weren't made by Metro employees. And the way it works, you have 3 different levels of review. You've got one, you have General Services. They're looking at things like, okay, you have a vehicle that takes diesel gas, but you've got regular gas in there. So they'll follow up on things like that. Or you've got something that only carries 10 gallons of gas, but you've got 15 gallons worth of purchase. They'll follow up on that. At the department level, they do a review. But you also have The credit card company that issues the cards, they'll do a review. So think of your own credit card where, you know, like I've had a Visa for 30 years. And so if there's something like a purchase made in New York all of a sudden, or like a Tiffany's, which I've never been to Tiffany's, but just something that looks really unusual, they'll stop it. And so of the 7 transactions that weren't made by a Metro employee, 6 of them were discovered by that particular credit card company. And they did follow the process where they freeze the card, they follow up with the department, then they cancel them. We didn't have any recommendations on this one, but I will say when we were talking to the departments, we really weren't looking at processes so much, just as data analytical software. But we did discover there's a large variance in how much they're actually monitoring their cards. So the way it works, you've got the code that gives the responsibility for the cards to General Services. Then General Services has an administrative order which tells the department, you know, you need to be doing A, B, and C. But there's just a large variance on how much they're actually following up and how much they're actually monitoring. So one of the things we're going to do, we're going to split it up where we're going to put on our audit plan where we're looking at the big departments that have fuel cards. That helps us in a couple different ways. We can look at it in more detail. And since it's so straightforward in terms of development, it's really good when you're developing auditors. When you have something that's so straightforward, it makes it easier, or it helps us develop them, and we can also expand those ACL skills.
Who discovered it? Was it Wright discovered it, or was it the credit card company?
It was, Wright Express is the credit card company, so they were the ones on
I
6
thought
of
the
them.
fleet manager, I didn't know they were both. Okay.
Fleet found 1 of them, but
Okay.
6 of them were through the credit card company.
Okay.
Not have any questions?
Oh, let me ask one question. There was a review, I'm on page 36, question A. There was a review of 25 transactions.
Yes.
Now, were there a whole lot more than 25, I'll assume?
On the first one, I think
But
there
I
were
mean,
83.
you only reviewed 25, but, or were there only 25 transactions?
Well, within that bucket, so you've got a whole lot more transactions on fuel cards besides obviously the 25. But when we were on this particular case where we're looking at out of the state of Tennessee,
Right.
there were 83.
There were 83.
And then of the 83, we pulled 25.
All right, but the next paragraph, 25% of the ones you looked at were fraudulent.
Yes.
Did you expand the test?
No. And we actually, that was something we were talking about today as we were looking through this in the report that, and again, there were 83 of them, and we went through that, but that's one of the things we're gonna look at in more detail when we do future.
Okay.
Gonna try to look at that more on a department level and the overall, add that to the scope of the other audits that they do so that you can see that more specifically where that might be happening.
Maybe too much, but would you want to determine the source of the fraudulent issue? Just to see if possibly it leaked through.
No, those are good
Should
questions.
have been one person.
I mean, it could be one person out of the department, so if you determine the source, you might determine some
Right.
problems.
But as you have it written, of those transactions, 100% of them were caught.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't think that was an audit step, but it's a good audit step.
Yeah.
That's why there were no findings.
Yeah.
But Mr. Frazier brings up a good point. You kinda wanna see how pervasive it is. So if you have a problem with the 25, how.
I agree, yeah,
No, that's good.
I mean, you need both. You need preventive as well as a good vendor.
How do you explain the difference? So I'm looking at parks on page 35. 7,193 transactions and a total of about $281,000. But then underneath it's the sheriff, which had almost 2,000 more transactions, and they had their total dollar amount was less.
That I couldn't tell you. I mean, we could look into it. We didn't really look that deep.
Well, and marginally, the codes just had another, 1,100, and they almost doubled their gas from 44 to 72. So, yeah, there's some questions that would be why the consumption is different by
Yeah, I mean,
transaction?
I was
Well,
looking at
codes-
police and,
Codes could be, they are out quite a bit in terms of codes
It's
enforcement.
just transaction, if you take amount per transaction, there's a lot of inconsistencies. That is probably what that's.
I was looking at the fire and the amount is, compared to the police, they have a lot less transactions, but their amount's about half. And I assume the fire, because their transactions, the fire equipment probably takes in more gas.
Well, I will say, like parks typically.
Parks is that way too, because they run big trucks, you know,
Okay.
versus,
Trucks and-
you know, automobiles.
They also have like weed eaters, things of that nature. There's a lot of theirs is more equipment
Oh, see.
as opposed to vehicles, whereas your sheriff's department, for the most part, is gonna be, I will say, it's gonna be vehicles. They do a lot of like extradition where they're going out of state and things of that nature.
You could play around with that a lot, anyway.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Tina,
Alright,
something
so,
you have a great interest in.
today, Wanda let me know that she was not gonna be able to present this afternoon, but she also let me know that she had not received everyone's, 5 to 8 top candidates. So what she needs from us is she needs all 6 people on the audit committee to send her your top 5 to 6 candidates. She will pull that together into a total of 10 to 12 most likely. And then we can relook at those, and she's gonna run the background checks before we do interviews. The problem that we found doing interviews and then background checks is that some of the people we spent quite a bit of time researching and interviewing didn't pass the background check. So we wanna do the background check before we interview. So we will probably we definitely will need to have a special meeting or two in January in order to have the interviews and come to some conclusions. If you all would go ahead though, if you can do this before Christmas and if you haven't gotten her your 5 to 8 top candidates, please do that. And I will work with her on getting back the list of finalists to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's 2 weeks, so let's just go ahead and, today was the deadline. And, because we have to, we need to, there's so many, and if everybody has a different pool of 5 to 8, it could be something that she'll have to work with you. If it's okay, Gina will work with me, hopefully get a good list. I believe the vice mayor last time said if we have 3, we need to interview at least 6, so we have more than that, like 10 to 12 is our goal. And I believe it takes a little time to do these,
Background checks
Checks.
take at least 3 weeks.
so we really need to go ahead and knock that out.
Okay.
And, if you don't mind. And I think you said that 4 as of this afternoon.
She had gotten 2 more this afternoon, so she needs 2 more.
Two
There's
more.
2 more of you that need to get your
And then
candidates to you.
we'll look at the list and hopefully we can come up with 10 or 12. And if the committee so desires, we can, well, I guess we need to go, of those 10 or 12, we'll go ahead and do the background checks and then we can, before we have set the interview dates, we can send out the names of who they are.
Yes, and then you will need to do your due diligence on your own about all of those candidates and about gathering questions that you want to ask that will be in addition to the standard questions that HR will provide.
So what we'll do, once we come up with this 10 or 12, let's say they all pass, we'll schedule it. The Metro Auditor will get our schedules, schedule a really either a half day or all day. And each one takes about an hour and a half. We'll have standard questions that the vice mayor gets to pick which one the 3 or 4 he wants.
Thank you.
But we
Last
all-
time I didn't, no, I did get a pick, which one?
We all ask the same questions to each candidate, so it's consistent. And then as any sort of follow-up, we can then ask the candidates anything we individually want to, that we might have found out about or whatever. And we'll continue down this road until, it's our charge to have 3 qualified candidates from this committee, that it's then presented to the council, and the council people will take that and we'll rank them, so y'all will have that responsibility. And then the council votes, 1 vote, not 3 readings, to approve. So we'll continue down that road. Now, understand there has, the term is 8 years, right? And we're in the last 2.
2 years.
And there could be concerns about that, about the candidate pool, as well as the 3, providing 3. But it's my understanding, Terry, that that's per charter. That's not per audit bylaws that we adopted. That's per charter.
That's correct.
That's that the voters passed. So that's what, until that gets changed, that's what we have. Okay, and we'll get there. Any questions?
I'd just like to say it's been my good fortune to work with Gina a number of times over, a number of years, and I did think of a conspiracy to delay this as long as possible so we could continue to have that opportunity. But I was an early respondent to this, and I encourage you, if anybody hasn't responded, let's do it and move that along.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be important for the future of the city to have as much stability as we can, and the budget issues that I think all of you are where I'm working on, some of the other things too. Along with that, other spots of the government need to show some stability, and I think filling this position permanently and expeditiously as we can is in our best interest.
Well, I appreciate the administration as well as the council for supporting this interim, because it's been a while, it's been stable, and we're moving on, and I appreciate that.
And it's okay, you will not hurt my feelings when you select someone.
Okay.
I love all of you, but
That was a little repetitive, but I did want to get out there to let anybody know. Any older?
Any what?
Any other comments from the people that's been going through
No,
this
I
for the last
just
6
was
months?
concerned that you didn't mention to the new members that I was selected as the smoothest transition.
That is true.
He was
I was thinking that.
self-selected as the smoothest. He is.
So there were 7 or 6 questions, and I was able to move from whatever the response was from the candidate into my question very smoothly. And it was noted for the
There was
record.
a judgment on that, okay.
He wasn't even aware he was asking the question.
yeah, we were calling him Smooth Jim by the end.
That's right.
Okay, well, this is on, okay.
Big shoes.
Any other questions about that process? Okay, like I said, we'll get through it, and it will be fine.
The other 2 items noted here in unfinished business are what came from that annual self-assessment. These 2 items did not get the acceptance vote in April, and so they will need to be accepted.
And, from last year? Okay. Do we have those in here?
These are not in here. That's what I was looking for as well.
Got it.
I was gonna say, it's the single one that the manager letter came on, or from big office in
Well, it's been 9 months.
I know. This happened last year, this did happen last year as well.
We probably need to see it before we accept it,
I would agree.
even though I'm sure
We got new
half of the
members-
committee
we
has.
got
Yeah,
members
because
voting, had
the
to
3
have it.
new members haven't seen it.
So we just need to defer these 2 until the next meeting.
They were not accepted?
No, like, they're supposed to make a formal vote after you all
Oh.
presented those,
Oh, they did.
and it did not happen. The presentation was just really good.
Oh,
They were just more
formality.
Before 18?
I'm sure I was out of town, and
I'm sure it was under my charge.
I mean, we could probably find them really fast if y'all need this tonight, but if not, we have another meeting
No,
coming up.
this is just to complete complete the self-assessment.
We have another meeting coming up in 2 months.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is the next item. In here, you will see the proposed 2020 meeting plan. And that schedule it's an every other month regular meeting starting in February. But because we are talking about the candidates needing to be interviewed, et cetera, we will have to have special meetings. There are sometimes special meetings called, and that's what those meetings will be, and they will most likely start in January. Usually send out a poll for you to pick some dates that work for you, and then we pick the date or dates that we have quorum.
Okay, these dates, they're off council meeting dates, correct?
Yes.
We have had in the past met on council nights, and in the past met on the off week. Y'all prefer this?
Personally, I prefer off the
Okay.
council week. I have some business meetings, I don't know when they're
That's what was
occur, but,
happening.
Yeah.
We did it we've done it both ways. In the last 2 administrations, I think we've done it like this, okay? Without any comments, then that's our agenda. That's our, we need to approve this or not. Why don't we have a motion to approve the dates and the proposed agenda topics?
So moved.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Okay. And I don't see anything else. Is there a need for an executive session?
I'm aware of.
Just going back, are we at 4 o'clock for each of the meetings?
You want to do 2?
No, 4 o'clock's good, I just want to confirm, I'm putting in my calendar.
One day.
One day.
Okay.
Can we take a few minutes for an executive session?
Ask legal.
Okay, all right. You remember the list of the bases for which we can go into executive session? Do you have any question? I just want to make sure that one of those applies for what you want to bring up. Okay, very good.
Okay,
So I'll move to adjourn.
adjourn the public session. Any further discussion? Anything else to come to front before?
No, sir.
Okay. All in favor of adjourn?
Aye.
We're adjourned.